Chapter 18. You should hurry to Paris before it gets hot, fellow campers told us as we basked on an Italian beach. If you hurry, you can visit Paris and miss the summer heat, we were told on the French Riviera. We reluctantly left the sun-drenched Mediterranean coast and headed north. We missed the heat. We've never missed heat so much. Photographs portray Paris in the rain, with glistening streets reflecting the towers of Notre Dame. Old etchings depict a ride in a horse-drawn cart through the Bois de Boulogne. They don't hint at camping in the rain in that same bois, dashing barefoot to preserve shoes through puddles to a distant bathroom. They don't give a clue of sleeping under a leaky, tarpaulin-draped ping-pong table or cooking on a rain-drenched gasoline stove as dripping branches toss rivulets of water down your already soaked back. Anita's folding ping-pong table had become a vital part of our life. Lashed to an inner wall against the closets while we traveled, it was the first item to be removed from the bus when we set up camp. With a tarpaulin draped over the table, the secluded area beneath it served as an extra bedroom at night. One end of it served as my kitchen with our smoke-belching camp stove. It had good reason to belch. Our pigeon French request for white gas had produced kerosene. With it, after half an hour's effort, it was possible to get a sort of flame accompanied by thick black smoke that stuck to pans, stove, and the cook. The same table was my laundry room. With washboard set firmly in a deep pot, I scrubbed in cold water and hard soap. It didn't really rain all the time. There were days when the laundry almost dried, days when I watched the skies, calculating how long I could leave clothes on the line before the next downpour. April in Paris may be heavenly, but that June was hell. Jill and Court suffered through strep throat infections. Others coughed and sniffled. Court developed a flaming boil on his shin. The doctor at the American hospital recommended hot compresses, and I fought the stove and smoke to produce them. Cooking became less a problem as various members of the family succumbed to stomach flu. No one dared suggest the possibility of food poisoning. If Paris is all about love, I certainly missed the point. I began to hate my husband, my teenage daughters, the bus, and the stove. Vernon and the two older girls responded by disappearing to explore the charms of Paris. I was left with sick kids, wet laundry, the bus, and the stove. I continued with the hot compresses and cursed Vernon's reassuring words, "Don't forget the big picture." If this was the big picture, I'd been framed. Paris is many things to many people. I've always been deeply moved by sensitive descriptions of the city. Charles Trenet or Chevalier or Edith Piaf put it to music and created a world of sultry enchantment. To me, even children's songs sung in French sound sultry. My personal experience of Paris had none of those charms. I could understand why Gauguin left for Tahiti. His wife probably nagged him about the kitty's clothes not drying. And I would have bet a bottle of tetracycline that Van Gogh had an earache before he ever left for Arles. One evening, Vernon and I went alone by metro with hopes of finding the Paris of artists and absinthe parlors, musicians, philosophers, life and sin without tourists. After several transfers, we spotted a station we knew to be in the Latin Quarter and climbed the stairs in search of adventure. We walked for blocks past dimly lighted apartment windows and shuttered door fronts before deciding we had chosen the wrong station or the wrong exit. At our next stop, we found a small restaurant with nothing to condemn it as a tourist trap. The proprietor grudgingly served us coffee before closing for the night. Large groups of young people emerged from the subway carrying knapsacks and wildflowers, returning from a country vacation. The hearty atmosphere convinced us our search for sin was not going to be easy. A few nights later, we swallowed our pride and our independence and joined a tour that promised the real Paris at night, plus free champagne. The bus held 30 other humans as reluctant as we were to be tourists. We careened through the Bois de Boulogne, past the Eiffel Tower, around the Arc de Triomphe, as our guide, a Polish refugee, the last son of a noble family, described the more obvious landmarks. When we reached Montmartre, the driver inadvertently sheared the fender from a parked car. We left him to explain that one and walked in a neat row past sidewalk cafes and admired the sidewalk artists who, in some intuitive fashion, took us for tourists. And now we go to see famous Pigalle and watch the dancing and drink the free champagne, proclaimed our Polish prince. We obediently climbed back into the bus. Voila, hiccuped an elderly German. Is it really a dangerous place? Two blue-haired American women sounded hopeful. The driver, untouched by his recent demolition, swirled through narrow streets with Gaelic flair and parked at the entrance of a dark alley. We stumbled over slippery cobblestones through the darkness to our first nightclub. Women in tight-slit skirts and snug striped T-shirts leaned against tables and stared coolly at the men in our group. A scowling young man in crotch-clinging trousers, beret, and red scarf knotted at the neck of his striped shirt leered at the women, a cigarette dangling from his lower lip. There were no other customers in the place, and we were led to our seats, grandstand benches lining one end of the room, certainly not the intimate table for two we had anticipated. For 15 minutes we waited for action, admiring the natives, who seemed no more bored than we, but a lot less self-conscious. Then the front doors burst open, and another crowd of dazed but optimistic tourists was ushered to the adjoining bleachers. Habitués of the club by now, we assumed suitable bored expressions, slumped casually in our seats, and watched them with narrowed eyes. Half glasses of sweet muscatel were served, and the show began. For an hour we watched as female Apache dancers were tossed into far corners of the dance floor by their partners, who looked scornful, and who never lost the dangling cigarettes that clung, leech-like, to the lower lip. Members of the audience looked despairing, except for a pair of honeymooners from West Berlin who were laughing with us. The grand finale included a can-can flurry of dingy petticoats and a striptease with our elderly German in the front row being asked to assist. He loved it. Our guide spoke in glowing terms of the next club and the free champagne awaiting us. We followed obediently up a narrow flight of stairs and into another bleachers-lined room. The entertainers looked familiar. You don't suppose they hurried on ahead of us, changing clothes along the way? Asked Vernon. In desperation, hoping for any kick, we slogged down the cheap, sweet wine and decided our first organized tour was our last, even though the laughs might have been worth it. It would be a singular satisfaction to return to Santa Barbara with the same number of children, no more and no fewer. This balance was almost upset in Paris. One of the reasons we spent so many days there was to witness the July 14th Bastille Day celebration. There was no rain on Bastille Day, in itself a reason for jubilation. Most of the children had recovered, and there had only been 2 sudden attacks of stomach flu during the night. We left camp early in the morning to find a parking space near the parade route. So did several thousand others. We were lucky to find a spot across the river from the Place de Concorde. Court and Jeff were still weak, and I stayed with them while Vernon led the others to the parade. Staying in the bus wasn't all that bad. As the parade ended, many of the marching units crossed the bridge, passing near the bus, and we could hear the bands and watch planes as they flew over, leaving tricolor trails in the sky. Our parade goers returned several hours later, totally exhausted and bursting with stories. "Andy got lost, Mommy." "But we found him easily," said their father. "We had to look for a long time," said Christy. I knew we'd find him. Vernon could make any mishap sound like planned entertainment. "The policeman found him, but he was crying a lot," said Vicky. She wasn't about to let her baby brother have center stage for long. "Not policemen," said Jill. "They're gendarmes." "The policeman gave him sugar," said Vicky stubbornly. "He hated it," said Kara, the girl with few words. Vernon had set up a base station, sending scouts out in all directions. When they found the local gendarmerie and heard the screams issuing from within, they knew we were in the right place. A hovering group of uniformed men were plying Andy with sugar cubes and trying to comfort him. Kara was right. He hated it. With the children still reporting on the parade and the great search, Vernon started the motor and turned the wheels, ready to pull out into the long line of traffic. There was a squeal of brakes, a crash, and a modest pileup of cars. A young man picked himself out of the center of the heap and unwound his motorcycle from the front of a black Citroen. We wondered at the speed with which a gendarme appeared on the scene before it became clear that he'd been the driver of the car that hit the cyclist, tossing the latter into the front of a car going in the opposite direction. Fortunately, the injuries were negligible. Everyone gathered beside the bus door, cursing Vernon in hysterical bursts of French. "I hadn't even moved onto the street," Vernon insisted. No one heard him. "Mais non," screamed the gendarme. The young cyclist, who had originally been angry with the officer, decided to accept the word of the law and turned his fury on us. I tried to calm him as I brought the first aid kit and cleansed and bandaged the small scrape on his leg, his only injury. People who passed on the sidewalk became interested. It didn't matter whether or not they had seen the crash, they were willing to offer a verdict. No one spoke English. The bedlam continued for the better part of an hour, during which we exchanged documents. The gendarme carefully copied all of our information. "Why don't you copy down all of their information?" Vernon suggested to me. It offered some variety to the scene. Soon what had begun in a style that threatened us with nothing short of several years on Devil's Island dissipated to a year in the Bastille, and finally faded to the point where everyone shook hands and departed. The Frenchmen had vented their emotions regarding people who touched their cars, a more serious crime than adultery, and had enjoyed the dramatic moments. After 3 weeks of death-defying travel in Paris, we knew that the French acknowledged few logical rules of traffic. We had discovered that if a driver sticks out his arm to signal, it meant only that his car window is open. The next morning, with Bastille Day, rain, and pestilence behind us, we headed north. Chapter 19. Belgium and Holland are a blur of images. In our brief stay in Antwerp and throughout Holland, we found hospitality, warmth, and assistance wherever we went. Like the Belgians, the Dutch were still grateful to the United States for helping to liberate them during World War II. We had not yet become the ugly Americans. We were so well established in our camping routine that we were truly at home all the time. Home was where the bus was, and it was in a lot of places. We spent a few days in Rotterdam and Amsterdam, but the rains were so frequent that the campgrounds were drenched and the bus's tires sank into the ground. Near The Hague, we found a wonderful seaside campground that took pride in offering accommodations for 10,000 campers. It was run efficiently and the rains passed over the coastline. The children found playmates. Christy and Joe were surrounded by young men. I was pleased with the fresh breeze that actually allowed me to dry laundry that had been accumulating for days. 2 young German men eyed my washboard enviously one morning, and I told them they were welcome to borrow it and showed them where to return it. After supper that evening, Vernon had brought out his accordion, and the boys returned with my washboard and a guitar. Their clothes showed no sign of having been scrubbed, but as soon as the guitarist went into action, joining Vernon in a hot rendition of the St. Louis Blues, the other young German began to stroke the metal ridges of the washboard vigorously with one half of a wooden clothespin. The rhythm section added the final touch. A large crowd gathered and joined in on American folk songs, fluent with the English lyrics, although limited in conversation. We never knew if the boys were courting my daughters or my washboard, but they offered to buy the latter. Vernon said it was the American Clean Queen Chicago, Illinois label that attracted them. It may have been the Steinway of laundry equipment, but I couldn't part with it. The days by the sea were pleasant, but July was passing rapidly and we had to move on. The bus, however, was still calling the shots. It wasn't long after leaving The Hague that it developed familiar complaints. High gear had been slipping occasionally for more than 100 miles, and Vernon had been able to tighten things and hope for the best. He was inclined to regard the bus as having a certain amount of native intelligence, but gave himself credit for slightly more, and hoped to outwit the beast. There was no telling what the bus might do if it sensed we were intimidated by it. We headed north, planning to drive through German Friesland and on to Denmark in a couple of days. But before we reached the Afsluitdijk, the long dike separating the Zuider Zee from the North Sea, high gear was snapping back and forth like a 5-year-old's loose tooth. Christy, Jill, and I took turns sitting on a box in the aisle beside Vernon. By looping the handles of a string shopping bag over the gear shift and pulling hard, we could hold it in gear, But even then it could snap out, and Vernon would go through a series of shifts and clutch maneuvers, hoping a cog would fit and hold. This helped dramatize the 25-mile length of the dike. Kara questioned the rumor that a small boy had been able to plug a leak in the dike with his finger. "I think it would take more than a little boy," she said. Court said it'd probably be necessary to plug the dike with a whole lot of little boys. For the last few miles, Vernon abandoned high gear, and we crept slowly along in second, until at the north end of the dike we saw a welcome tent sign in the town of Harlingen. We inched our way along narrow streets and around corners, following the arrows until we found a tiny camp behind the dike wall. Only half a dozen campers were there, and they gathered around, greeting us like old friends. News spread fast in that charming little fishing village, where an old-fashioned Dutch life, complete with wooden shoes at the doorsteps, flourished. The mayor arrived on our first morning and invited Vernon to go on one of the local shrimp boats with a skipper who spoke English. Vernon left on a shrimp boat with its spreading butterfly wing nets at 3 o'clock in the morning. The children and I roamed the little town, which was checkerboarded by canals, with bridges at each cross street. We passed rows of small brick houses with steep roofs and windows hung with sparkling white lace curtains over flowering plants. Plump, lazy cats looked out on tiny, manicured gardens. We noted rear-view mirrors beside second-story windows and discovered that elderly ladies, who sat sewing in upper bedrooms, liked to look at the passing scene and thus had a discreet view of the length of their block. In mid-afternoon, we spotted the returning shrimp boats and hurried to meet Vernon. He introduced us to his crew, and they gave us a parting gift of a dozen small flounder caught in the shrimp nets. Vernon said that food had been the central theme of the 12-hour trip. There was hot chocolate at 4 in the morning, hot tea at 5, a breakfast of coffee and breads at 6. In mid-morning there was a break for another steaming drink. Lunch was a nourishing meal of meat and vegetables served in layers in deep bowls. For an afternoon snack, they had fresh shrimp cooked in seawater. Vernon's curiosity led him to a well-patronized liquor store whose curtained windows and veiled front door gave little clue to its wares. Privacy appeared to be the utmost importance in such a purchase. He returned to the bus with a large tin labeled Esso Lube and an innocent-looking white-painted milk bottle, each containing Dutch gin. He was told it was common practice to smuggle gin out of the country in this disguise, but we preferred the image of a housewife demurely sipping from a milk bottle in the privacy of her kitchen while her husband was getting well lubricated in the garage. Avocat, a Dutch beverage that tasted like eggnog, drew our admiration. It was so thick that when a child tipped a glass, as children are prone to do, one had the opportunity of picking it up before the contents could run out. It was also in Harlingen that we met Piet de Jong, a journalist from Leeuwarden, the nearby provincial capital of Friesland. He interviewed us as we sat on the grass, although he probably answered more questions than he asked. Before he left that day, we made plans to move on to Leeuwarden, where he said there was camping space and an excellent garage where the bus could be repaired. We were led out of Harlingen by a small army of tow-headed boys racing ahead of us on foot, on bicycles and tricycles, some of them pushing baby brothers in strollers in reckless exuberance, waving and shouting goodbye. Our financial situation continued to be serious. Our agent in Santa Barbara, who had not produced the money he was to have received by selling several vacant lots for us, was victimizing us. Priced the property for quick sales, agreeing we would have $5,000 waiting for us at each capital, and he could keep the balance of each sale. We had been living on the money from Vernon's Air Force retirement checks and the rent on our house. It was enough to get by, but didn't allow for frivolous extras like a new transmission. Our accommodations required little cash. In Leeuwarden, Pete led us to a soccer field where we could park and use the facilities in the office. As the bus wheels sank slowly into the damp field, we waited for news of the transmission and accumulated crowds of neighborhood children. Vernon's positive thinking again paid off, and within 24 hours we had another transmission, which was found just as the first one had been, only 20 miles away. The mechanic was a friend of Pete's, and in order that we not have to spend a night in his garage, we brought all his tools to the camp. He and Vernon forced the bus onto large wooden planks like water skis to prevent further sinking and went to work. It was a delightful week. One of the nicest things Pete did for us was to lead us to a source of hot baths. We hesitated to say it had been many months since we'd had such luxury, but months of cold showers had held little enchantment. In the town hall just a few blocks away, there was a public bathhouse, and for 7 cents we could spend a half hour in the luxury of a steaming tub. What a year that was in Europe. Oberammergau, the running of the bulls in Pamplona, the music festival in Avignon, Paris in the spring, the Olympics in Rome. We missed them all. Those losses were redeemed by Pete, who introduced us to Polstockerspringen, a singularly specialized Frisian sport. When the natives hunted along the narrow canals for eggs of a small bird, the hunters had to leap across these canals, gather the eggs, put them in their caps, and jump back. The entire operation was pretty messy. Someone decided to use a pole, and a technique resembling pole vaulting evolved. Soon the eggs, which had an unpleasant fishy taste, were forgotten, and the leaping, or liepping, became the point of contest to prove the most skilled liepper. There was a brief time when the lieppers and the lieppie watchers disagreed as to who would be responsible for the event. A truce was reached in 1959, and the Frisk Leppersbund was formed. We were witnesses to their 1960 contest. As guests who had traveled the greatest distance, by some 8,000 miles, to witness the events, we were given seats of honor in the judges' stand. Participants were divided according to age, including a small group of girls in their late teens. A long pole was carefully planted in the mud and lightly braced against a long wooden platform at the water's edge. The jumpers made a long run, grabbed the pole, tried to climb higher as it progressed in an arc above the canal, and hoped to land on the far side of the canal. Shouts of joy and derision arose when a jumper made it only halfway, splashing into the mid-channel muck. The transmission search had unearthed the third and last 1947 Ford Transit transmission in Europe. The cost had suddenly risen, even though the demand was probably on a par with the supply. Even if we had the money to buy it, we had no space in which to carry it. Certain that the demand lay in our hands, we took our chances and headed north. We left the campground in Lübeck in northern Germany early on a rainy July morning, anxious to reach our friends in Sweden. Usually when we packed up to move on, the children complained, "We'll never find such a keen campground," or "There's so many cute boys in this camp." The Lübeck camp was not one of those, and the only complaint came from Vicky. "Can't we do something different today, Daddy?" Her voice was shrill with anticipation. We controlled the urge to respond with, "What in blazes do you think you've been doing for the last 6 months?" Our nomadic life in exotic places had become normal to our little gypsies. This was well demonstrated by Jeff's occasional postcards to his third-grade school buddy, Dow. He could begin well enough, "Dear Dow, we are in Italy," or "Dear Dow, we are in Paris." Then he would turn to one of us, "But what have we done lately?" The wonders of Europe are not worth writing home about for a 9-year-old. "We'll be taking a ferry to Denmark this evening," Vernon said. "That should be pretty exciting. The ferry is famous for a fabulous buffet table with all kinds of food. They call it a smorgasbord. We can eat all the way to Denmark." As we stopped to fill our gas tank for the next leg of our trip, at 5 miles per gallon we stopped often, Jill spotted 2 trucks with U.S. Armed Forces license plates. Vernon asked the attendant about them. In a German-English mix, we learned there was an American radar station only a few miles from town. "Hamburgers," shouted Jenda. "Peanut butter," bellowed Jeff. Even Vicky thought these enticements were adequately different. Vernon's disability retirement from the military gave us privileges at the many American bases in Europe, and satisfied the children's occasional yearning for the familiar. Nothing would suffice but that we should stop at the base before heading for the ferry. Make that 2 for the smorgasbord, I thought. The base was not easy to find. We knew we were in the British sector of Germany, about 3 miles from the Soviet zone. In those days, accidental crossing into Soviet-controlled East Germany could mean long hours of questioning by the police and possible arrest. After almost an hour of wandering, we were ready to give up. When we spotted an American Jeep on the road ahead, the children shouted, "Follow that Jeep!" We turned onto a one-track muddy lane as the Jeep disappeared in the mist. There were deep drainage ditches on either side. Halfway up a slippery hill, we found 3 parked military vehicles surrounded by a mire of gumbo. We slithered to a stop. The kids tumbled out of the bus and sloshed to the top of the hill, where a dozen bemused soldiers explained that there was no base, only a small radar tower they hoped to dismantle and remove within the next 2 hours. A sergeant advised us against trying to turn around. If you stay on this lane for 2 miles, you'll come to a paved road. A few hundred yards and several minutes later, the bus developed a mind of its own, slithering to one side of the road, back to the other, and in a slow-motion nightmare tipping to a 60-degree angle as it came to rest against a mud bank. Our only 2 doors on the right side of the bus were jammed into mud and water bubbled beneath. The only serious damage was to a flat of eggs on the kitchen counter that slid and cracked against the facing seat. No one was hurt. "Hey, Vicky, is this different enough?" asked Vernon, restoring balance to a bad situation. Momentary fright disappeared in the delight of climbing out through the roof hatch. I decided to abandon ship by backing out of a window, causing my young audience to giggle when I became temporarily wedged with skirts caught high over my head. Christy, Jill, and I sloshed back through the mud to ask for help from our gallant troops. The soldiers returned immediately in one of their large trucks and wrenched our bus from its moat, causing the motor to shift slightly from its mounts. Although it still ran, there was a raucous clatter as the fan chewed against the radiator. A twist here and there, and holding our breaths until we reached the end of the muddy lane, we chugged back into Lübeck and the campground. The mechanics we found the next day said they had work backed up for a month and couldn't help us. Vernon asked if he could just drive the bus over an oil pit so he could try to repair the damage himself. Within a half hour, 2 mechanics were watching. In an hour, 4 were offering suggestions, and within 3 hours, half a dozen men had gone to work. They repaired the damage, and we were again on our way to the ferry and the famous smorgasbord. Footnote on this page regarding my skirts.